Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with part 2 of this 3-part video series on this radio-controlled 1/16 scale M4A3 Sherman tank. The model that you see is built for private commission and belongs to a private collector. As I often mention in these videos, I frequently take on commission-built projects from models ranging between 1/35 scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@EastCoastArmory.com. As I mentioned before, this is part 2 of a 3-part video series. In part 1, I go over the model's condition when it came to the shop, and I give the model a thorough in-box review. In addition to that, I also go ahead and walk over several aspects of the model's construction, bring it up to the condition that we have here. In this particular video, part 2, we're going to be focusing exclusively on the model's external detail fittings, the paintwork, and the weathering work. In part 3, we're going to be taking this model out for a test drive and having it being put through its paces. So stay tuned because there's going to be a ton of info coming right at you. To start this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this is the M4A3 Sherman tank, or more specifically a mid-production variant of the M4A3. Probably one of the most interesting aspects of the Sherman tank, and it's also the thing that throws a lot of people off, is just how many different variants of the same vehicle that are out there. And this actually stems all the way back to when the vehicle was first adopted by the US Army, when they really didn't know exactly how to power and also how to create this vehicle. When the M4 Sherman was originally adopted, it was actually intended to be a cast hull vehicle and was supposed to be powered by a radial engine. Well, in terms of the manufacturing, the cast was viable, but they had to figure out exactly how to do it en masse and do it reliably, and this took some figuring out to do. In the interim, they went ahead and switched over the manufacturing process to a mosaic type assembly where you had a combination of cast components and components made out of rolled steel. For the engine, the radial engine was a good power plant. Unfortunately, the demand was really needed for this engine for airplanes, and because of that, there weren't enough engines to go around, so an alternative solution was needed to be found. And it's because of these two conundrums why we have so many different variants of the Sherman, because every company who was in charge of tank design and tank production came up with their own solution, and that's why we have all these different A suffixes. The A1, the A2, the A4, in this case, the A3. What the M4A3 was the vehicle was powered by a Ford V8 gasoline engine. And this was arguably probably the best power plant that was developed for this vehicle during World War II. The GAA was a very reliable engine and output some very good performance. The engine would be the base and would be modified into the GAF, which would eventually power the M26 as well as also the T28 Super Heavy Tank, but that's a topic for another video for another day. For the hull manufacturing, the M4A3 originally utilized what's called the early production hull, which is what we see similar on the early patterns of the M4 and also the M4A2, where we had the small hatch with the blister type configuration. However, the designers figured out that they could make the design even more efficient and also have better ballistic protection if they changed the front angle and give the vehicle wider hatches. By shifting out some of the plates, they were able to come up with the hull that we have here. This hull has a pretty much continuous front armor plate that's made out of rolled steel with only a single casted component being the MG well, in combination, or I should say in comparison to the earlier versions of the vehicle that to comprise the front armor plate, it utilized almost like 5 or 6 pieces that need to have been jigged and welded together. So you can see how this really cut down on production time and also complexity. The hatches were redesigned to be a larger diameter hatch, and this was done to assist, or I should say make, the enter and exit of the vehicle easier, and was also important for doing this if the vehicle was hit and caught fire. The bigger hatch made it a bit easier to escape. The vehicle's hull still utilized a mosaic of assembly parts made out of both rolled steel and cast. However, in comparison to the early versions of the Sherman, this was much simpler to both fabricate as well as also assemble, which turned around the production and lead time. Aside from the hull, the turret also went through a myriad of different iterations, from the low bustle to the high bustle, and each of these had their own different specs. The later versions of the turret were interesting because they had a hatch dedicated to just the loader, which again made entering and exiting the tank much easier, specifically if the vehicle was hit and things were going sideways. But also the turret had some extra armor integrally casted into the side portion that gave it some better ballistic protection. However, during the production process, there were some turrets that were basically in the middle, and they kind of had attributes of the two, with more or less having some features while omitting others. And that's kind of the version that we have here. On this version, you'll see that the vehicle still has the split ring cupola. This would eventually be replaced with the panoramic cupola, but that came on production units that came after this one here. Another thing that made the mid-production unique was with the barrel clamp system for the M2HB. When the M2HB was not mounted into its pintle mount, the barrel would be removed from the receiver and the entire receiver would be strapped to the rear portion of the hull. Well, the clamps are in the configuration where you see on this model, where the receiver would be mounted and secured on the back, but the barrel would be mounted across the top portion of the turret with this configuration. As the design kept on improving, this would be revised and the barrel section would be mounted on a rail, which would also be on the rear bustle of the vehicle. These units were fielded by the U.S. military in both the Pacific as well as the Atlantic, and unlike the other versions of the Sherman that were issued out as Lend-Lease, the U.S. military didn't do that with the M4A3, and basically all the A3s were retained by the U.S. military and were kept up until their eventual retirement. The U.S. military had a large supply of these vehicles after World War II, and many of them continued to see service with both Army National Guard as well as also the Army Reserve for several years entering into the 1950s timeframe. Starting with the model suspension, what you see here is more or less what the kit gives you, and really the suspension is one of the strong points on the Mato Sherman overall. Some polish work, however, was done to the bogies by myself, and I mentioned this in the last video, but as a quick recap, on the faces here on all of the bogie housings, I went ahead and drilled in the 4 locations, which on the real vehicle are the threaded locations that are for fasteners to secure the bracket here to the opposite side when mounting to the reverse side of the vehicle. As I often mention in these Sherman videos, the bogie housing was a reversible component, and with the same casting you could utilize it for either side of the vehicle. You just switch on which side the bracket gets fastened to. When there's no bracket fitted to one side, the fastener location holes are still present, and it's a really great bit of detailing to add to your Shermans by just simply adding those 4 little holes into those locations. And this is true for not just the 1/16 scale counterpart here, but it's also really nicely done when you add the same detailing to a 1/35 scale Sherman and even to one of the 1/6 scale ones. In addition to the fastener locations, I did go ahead and smear some red putty on the faces and also on the top portions, not to mention the skid rails. As on the stock unit, there's a seam line present in these locations over here is how the unit gets bolted together. And this is something that can hurt the look of the build. So by eliminating the seam, it helps the look overall, and it gives the added cast texturing to the various locations that I just mentioned. Not so much on the skid rail, that was polished down, but for the top portions of the bogie housing and the front portions of the bogie housing, the cast texturing is definitely something that can improve the look of the build. The one thing that I do want to mention that was unique on this particular build compared to the other ones that I've done in the past was with the road wheels. On both the Tegan and the Henlong model, the road wheel is actually removable via a bolt on the inner portion here of the housing. You undo the fastener and then you can actually remove the wheel. Why this is relevant is because on my 1/16 scale model, specifically the ones with the rubber tires, I like to remove the rubber tire off of the rim and I paint and weather everything separately, and then I install the rubber tire at the very tail end and then install it, giving you a look like you see here. This is done to prevent any sort of overspray from getting onto the rubber surfaces, which can also hurt the look of the model. And I'm sure I'm going to have someone chiming in the comment section, but John, when these vehicles are repainted in field, the rubber gets overpainted every single time. Or when you paint over the rubber tire, it's not a big deal. It just chips off when the vehicle is in operation. And all that is valid, and it is true to a certain extent or another. On my builds, I personally like to have the tires just left in their rubber coloring. It just adds more contrast to the build, and it just works with the art style that I like, and so I tend to not want to have any paint on those. Well, for this model over here, you can't really take the wheels off, I've come to find out, because with the way the system is designed, the bogie is assembled, and then in order to take the wheel off, you basically have to remove the entire bogie, and that is a rabbit hole I definitely do not want to go into, specifically with all the electronics already fitted in place. So for this one here, I was actually just going to paint the model with the tires still mounted. And I may have mentioned this in the other video, but I took some masking tape and I taped up the majority of the sections of the tire just to mitigate as much of the overspray as possible. Then the model went through its prime paint and, you know, all the other techniques that I generally mention, and the tires were, you know, pretty covered up in paint. The masking tape did stick to the surface, not all that well. With this type of material over here, tape is not going to stick all that great, but that actually came to be a benefit because when it came time to remove the paint, this was very easily done and the paint just flaked away without any sort of problems. I just took my miniature box cutter and I put the blade basically on the surface and I just spun the road wheel and the paint just, you know, disintegrated and crumbled away into oblivion, leaving for the results that we have here. Of course, it would not be an ECA Sherman video if I did not point out that the return rollers that we have here are not rubber rimmed on the VVSS Sherman and are steel rimmed. And this is a common mistake that I've seen a lot of people make out there, and it's one that's very easily avoided and one that if you paint the thing properly, it will actually further enhance your build to no end. On the return rollers over here, I just hit them with a swipe of silver paint, as you can see, and this is something that would be very true to form to the real vehicle. If you ever saw a real VVS Sherman, specific one that's been driven, these wheels here are just going to be polished to a almost mirror image in some cases, depending on the type of track that the vehicle does have. In addition to the silver paint being added to the rollers, it was also added to the top portion of the skid rails. You can't really see them in frame here, but it's one of those features that it's best done obviously before the track's painted, and you have it in place, it just makes the build just that much more polished, I find. You will have some paint scratching through on the front and the rear section, or I should say some overlap of the brush strokes on those areas, and again, it just, you know, further just makes the model have that much more of a polished look. And yes, on the topic of steel rim wheels, this takes us to the idler wheel, and I cannot stress this enough because I've seen this mistake made more often than not. These wheels here were never rubber rimmed, specifically on the Sherman with the VVSS suspension. HVSS, totally different ballgame, but VVSS, these were steel rimmed and steel rimmed only. So if you are building any Sherman in any scale, regardless of how big or how small, make sure that the face portion of this wheel here is silver. It would be polished to the same regard as the return rollers as the track is in operation. In addition to making that silver, with a dry brush, you could also scratch up the face sections on either side. Again, this is where the teeth would wrap around. Yeah, paint would wear off on those locations fairly quickly. On the very front of the model, it takes to the sprocket. Nothing really much to mention here because it is left primarily stock. The only modification I made was what I mentioned and showed earlier, and that's a little divot that's right there in the center portion of the hub. Now that everything is painted and weathered, you really get to see just how much more improved it gives the model, and it just makes it look all that much more realistic by adding just a little hole in that location. Obviously, the same thing was also done to the one on the opposite side. And you can see it gives the exact same effect as the one we saw previously. The last component on the suspension I do want to mention is the track. The track is the same track that was mentioned in part 1 of this video series, and I said in that video, I'll say it in this one, and I'll keep on saying it for these type of vehicles. The Mato 1/16 scale Sherman track is the best VVSS track on the market. These tracks are excellent. Absolutely excellent in every regard. The Mato tracks come in a multitude of different configurations, which is a fantastic option for the builder where you can, you know, basically pick and choose on which track you personally like. Me personally, I really adore the 3-bar cleat, and in my opinion, I think that this is probably their best track sets of their excellent track sets that they already offer. The tracks are molded in a multi-part assembly, much along the lines of the real one, and this is different compared to Tegan and Henlong, where the track actually has the teeth already integrally molded on one of the sections, and this does have some disadvantages to it, but the best thing that I personally find about these tracks is that they are the most robust. The material used on these tracks are far stronger and are the strongest in the market compared to the other metal counterparts, and I'm specifically referencing the ones from Henlong and also the ones from Tegan. These tracks here are far more durable and will last a hell of a lot longer compared to those other counterparts. So these tracks, again, I will just, scream from the rooftops on how excellent they truly are. The other thing that I personally like about the Mato tracks is the color that they are molded in. They have this like black oxide finish on them that frankly looks identical to the parkerization or the oxide coating that was found on the actual units. So painting over these tracks are just not necessary. If we compare that to the tracks on the Tegan King Tiger and Tiger 1s, for instance, those tracks, they do have a black finish on them, but they're shiny and they're glossy. The ones on the Shermans, and also it's true for their Pershing tracks, are just matte in their color, and they look excellent. The other thing that's different compared to the German Tegan tracks is that those ones generally have a fine film of oil on the surface that needs to be washed off just by, dunking the tracks in paint thinner, as I mentioned in those videos. For these tracks here, that's just not the case, or at least from the examples that I've utilized on my builds. Even though I like the surface coloring on the tracks themselves, I do add some other effects to them in order to bring them up to the condition that you see on this model. This is something that I also reference in my other Sherman videos, but you'll see that on this model here, the end connectors are painted in a different color compared to the tracks themselves. The end connectors are actually olive drab. This is something that I've mentioned in a number of Sherman videos, but another way to get just a little bit of extra color pop on your build is to make sure that the end connectors are painted differently from the rest of the track, or even the model for that matter. On these Sherman tracks, there's again a multitude of different options available, and there were lots of options available for the teeth with their colors. Some of them were just a standard black color, but I have seen a number of them painted in olive drab, and that's the way I rendered them on this build. In order to paint the tracks olive drab, I basically took some standard masking tape and I covered up both the inner and outer portions of the track, and then the end connectors were left exposed and they were spray painted with Krylon olive drab, or Rust-Oleum. That's it, it was Rust-Oleum olive drab, my mistake. The Rust-Oleum olive drab was added to the surface, and then I just went ahead, peeled off the paint once dry, leaving for the look that you see here. As you can see, it adds a bit of extra color pop to the model of having the end connectors a different color compared to the band itself. Again, this is an optional bit of paintwork, but it's one that I definitely like to reference. Another detail, or I should say a painting technique that I did, was after the paint was added to the end connectors, I took the dry brush and I dry brushed the silver on in order to get the distress look that you see here. These tracks, of course, are metal and the vehicle is radio controlled, so as the model is driven, the paint will eventually wear out and so will the finish, and the tracks will start weathering naturally, but this gives it a good head start on that. From the tracks brings us to the rear section of the hull, and this is where you get to see some of the ECA modifications now fully painted as well as in their final form. So down here, hopefully I can get this on camera, but as I mentioned either in the last video or even in the product announcement video, there were several detail changes that were made to this area. The first was with the exhaust manifolds. The stock exhaust manifolds were very basic, but they were swapped out for a pair of Reston East Coast Armory ones because they had the more appropriate shape for these details that I'm talking about. The ECA ones were just dropped directly into place where the original ones once stood. Another detailing that was added was the replacement of the rear hatch. The vehicle did have a functional rear hatch, but it was a bit problematic to say the least. I go over all that information in that other video, and in a nutshell, the piece was very flimsy, chintzy, and it just fell apart. So rather than trying to salvage it, I just simply removed it altogether and swapped it out with a HT 3D printed part from ECA. That just drops on in its current location, and not only does it give you the appropriate detailing that wasn't there on the metal one, which oddly enough was functional, but it just lends itself for a better accurate component. The other thing I do want to mention is that the back area here did require some grinding and modifying in order to get all these new components to fit in place, and again, all this was referenced in the other video. It sounds pretty difficult to do, but it was easily addressed with the Dremel. in front of the exhaust manifolds takes it to the deflector grill, and the deflector grill was a new addition that I added to this model, and this is the component from East Coast Armory. This is a one-piece 3D printing, and it has all of the appropriate geometry and fins that would be present on the actual unit. Yes, the kit does originally have a deflector grill. Yes, it's made out of metal. No, it's not perfect and leaves lots of room for improvement, so much so that the swap out for the ECA one was definitely one that improved the model. In order to add the ECA one in place, I did have to fabricate the hull extensions, which is a common error found on these RTR models. This is true for the Tegan, the Hemlong, and the Mato here is absolutely no exception. The hull on these vehicles, they always seem to have them stop short, while on the real vehicle it connects all the way to the rear wall, and this would create a little box system for this unit to fold up in place when not in use. I do go over this in the other video, but I had to take the ECA sets, heavily modify them in order to make them to the Mato model. Once fitted in place though, they definitely are a huge improvement and are worth the work tenfold. As for the grille itself, you get to see what it looks like with its weathering added in place, as well that now that it's painted, you really get to appreciate all the fin and other subtle details that would be present on the real one that are found on the ECA printing, and yes, these are absent on the stock one from Mato. We have here the little lock retention pin right there. This is what would secure this unit in the folded state. And we also have the nice little convenient tuck away handle that when it's not in use is folded up in this position over here. And when you want to flip this thing up, you pop this thing open and it just flips and conceals up nice and out of the way. While on the topic of things that need to be replaced, brings us to the rear plate here, and basically all the details you see are brand new. So starting with the track racks, these are an iconic bit of detailing found on the M4A3, and the original Mato model does give them to you, and they are somewhat functional. However, just like with the other parts, they are very, very basic and generic in their overall shape, so they were replaced with the HD 3D printed ones from ECA. The ECA ones are designed so that you use some spare track links and you just mount them into place as you would on the real vehicle. Then there are these two straps that get secured in place that give you the remainder of the detailing. However, the units are, I mean, technically you can make them functional. The hinges are there. These are basically the 1/6 scale ones, but shrunk down to 1/16. In 1/6 scale, these are functional. You can pivot and open them up, but on 1/16 here, because of the very small size of all the hinges, it's more or less not intended for that, and they're meant to be just glued in the closed state that you see presently. The pieces are done at the very tail end of the build. As for the track links, these are the spare track links that come with the model, and they are the same pattern of ones that are found on the vehicle itself, as you can see. I don't believe I even weathered them or anything. I think I just took them straight out of the bag and threw them on because, again, the kit ones just have that nice color to them, and there's really no point trying to paint over them. The other thing that we see here that's another replacement part is the folding rack. Again, the stock one is there. Not exactly extremely detailed, so it was swapped out with the ECA HD 3D printed one. Here you can see what it looks like with all of the detailing present and painted. You see the hinges, the well beads, the little tie-down straps, the second row hinges with their fasteners all present, and even the wing nuts that are used to secure the rack in the closed state. The unit is semi-functional in that you can actually flip it up like I've done over here, but the actual folding mechanism is static on this version. On the ECA catalog for basically the lulls, I have a unit that is designed to be functional. It's literally the 1/6 scale one, just shrunk down to 1/16, and that is a set that honestly, it's not recommended for the faint of heart. Those are if you're really that crazy out there, and believe it or not, I've sold a few of them. So there are a few nut jobs out there that, you know, wanted to go ahead and add that detailing to their model. If that's you, rock on. For me personally, and I designed these sets, the static one here is more than suffice for the job at hand. The set, again, is functional in that you can pivot it out of the way like this. And when you do that, it reveals the starter crank, which is the kit original one. And on the bottom portion here of the rack, you get to see the other detailing, namely the stop right over here, which prevents it from flopping around, or I should say prevents it from bottoming out on the rear plate. And you also get to see the cleaning staves. The cleaning staves are not part of the ECA set. These are made out of wooden rods, just like they are on the real one. And then for the end connectors, I just make these out of heat shrink tubing. I cut them to shape, shrink them onto their wooden rods, and then they plug into the receptacles that are present on the ECA printing. On the end portion over here, there is the swab, which is a real swab. It's actually made out of a small little piece of pipe cleaner. And again, this is something that I do on my 116 just to give it that much extra detailing. The set is not made, or I should say this part here, it's made to be hinged on the 1/6 scale one. The 1/16, just like with the other parts, is just glued in place just to give you the detailing that's present. Back to the front of the model, you get to see the transmission cover now fully completed. And as I mentioned in the other video, this section had some cast texturing added to it, my usual format that I've referenced in a number of these videos. But now that the model is fully painted and completed, you really get to appreciate that cast texturing now in full effect. While on the transmission cover, you get to see the other details that were added, namely the comb device as well as the tow cable lock. These are both ECA cast resting components and were simply just mounted in the two locations that you see. The other thing I want to mention is with the tin work. So as I mentioned before, on the Mato model, it's unique in that it has the fender supports integrally molded on. Only unlike the Tagi one, which they're big and chunky, on the Mato one here, they're actually pretty thin and are for the most part to scale. The only modification that I made was with the geometry on the top portion. On the Mato stock version, it's squared off, and on the real Sherman, they're just literally just rounded off on the corner. So I just hit the corner here with some sandpaper or a needle file, blunting it off, and then giving you the proper shape that you see here. While also on the tin work brings us to the mounting fasteners. This is a bit of detailing that's absent on the Mato model, but are very easily added, and once done, you can see just how much better the build looks. So on the Sherman tank, the front tin work is actually fastened to the upper hull with these three fasteners here. There's 6 total, 3 on each side. And what's unique about them is that they are mounted from the inside out. So what this means is that the head of the bolt is on the inside of the fender, and then the nut is on the top, exposed. And on the model over here, in order to replicate that effect, is very easily done. You just take a wire brad and you snip off the bottom portion of it, leaving the head portion intact. Then you just simply glue the severed wire brads to the 6 locations found on the tin work, and ta-da, you now have your front fender detailing. From the front tin work takes to the side sections here where we get to see the side script mounting rails. This is something that I touched upon in the last video, but again, now that the model's fully completed, you really get to appreciate that work that was added in its final form. So as a quick recap, the Mato Sherman, just like what's true for other Sherman kits on the market, has this detailing integrally molded on, but when it is molded on, it tends to be a bit chunky than it really needs to be. So I simply went ahead and polished it down, removed it thoroughly, and then I was able to replace it with the segments made out of styrene strip. The styrene strip is to the scale, and then I cut it into 3 segments as it would be on the real vehicle. And here you get to see what it looks like with the unit perforated out, and also with the areas of spot welds that have been sculpted on. As you can see, it greatly helps the side detailing of this model, and it really gives it, again, just that much little added touch of realism. On the same section over here, you get to see the weld beads that have been added to the front armor plate. These are absent on the Mato model, or if they are there, they're very, very subtle and could use a bit of improvement. And the same detailing was also added to the weld beads, which will be found here on the rear plate. On the topic of the tin work takes us to the rear tin work sections. Again, I did reference this before, but as a quick recap, on the Sherman tank, on the rear portion, there would be the provisions for mounting on rear mud flaps. And the rear mud flap mounts are very, very simple on these tanks. It's basically nothing more than a piece of angle iron that has 3 holes drilled into it. And it's the same thing on the opposite side. What a lot of people don't realize, or the one common mistake that they make, is that they run this section from the end all the way to the end over here, and that's just not the case. On the Sherman tank, it ends somewhat short right over here, and the reason why there's this clearance over here is because on this side here we have the exhaust tailpipe for the auxiliary generator. The auxiliary generator exhaust on an M4A3 runs all the way on the under sponson over here, right to this section where on the real unit this is where the generator would be housed. The exhaust tailpipe here is a ECA cast resting component, simply mounted to the model and then just weathered accordingly. In order to fabricate these sections here, these are made out of Plastruct angle. I simply cut them to shape, drilled them out, glued them on, and then sculpted the weld beads, giving you for the final end result that you see here. And again, with this detailing added, the build just looks so much better. Moving up takes to the rear plate, and basically the details you see here are for the most part stock. Nothing really much to go over except for the addition of the ECA tow cable clamp that's found in this section over here, which would be present on the real vehicle. The other details that I've mentioned before are all still here. We have the drainage holes for all of the fuel fillers. Of course, I have the little fuel spill weathering detailing that I've mentioned in many of my other videos. Same is also true for the opposite side. There's another drainage section in this area over here, but obviously there's no fuel spillage because this is just an air blower and there shouldn't be any fuel in that. Here you can see the other drainage hole right here, and this one is actually for the radiator fluid, so it's coolant, so you're not necessarily going to have oil streaks like you would on the fuel fillers, but that is something to mention. The other thing I do want to point out is with the grill work. As I mentioned before, the grills on these M4A3s are something that could be improved, where generally there are these bars that are integrally molded on, but on the real unit, as I mentioned before, these are actually well beads. Well, here you get to see what it looks like with the well beads sculpted in their final format. Some Tamiya panel line accents used in order to really get the little knurling of the well beads to really pop out. And, you know, here's basically what it looks like when you're done. Does make it look a little bit more cruder, but again, this is true to form to the real one. These grills were not nearly as clean as they're present, or I should say as they're represented on these models in smaller scale. And by doing this, again, great way to help improve the look and the overall detail fidelity of your model. On the side portion here, we have the ECA tow cable cleats in place. They just get mounted to the appropriate locations, and then, you know, you're basically all set. One thing I do want to mention on the front cleat over here, there were several locations where this component was found, and this differs from the plants that manufactured the hull, as well as also the time frame of manufacture. These did change quite a bit, and there is some resources out there on the internet that basically tells you exactly where this part needs to go. I definitely recommend it. I have the link in the video description listed below to the website that actually has some very good information on this. But regardless, for the most part, it's generally in this location. Sometimes it's over here, but again, that depends more or less on the vehicle that you're working on. Moving to the front galoshes plate takes us to the front plate detailing, and on a Sherman it will take us to the headlights and the siren. Headlights are stock, nothing really much to mention there. The kit ones were very, very good. The siren was swapped out, however, with a ECA funnel horn. Hopefully that comes out in focus. On the side portion there, we have the kit, or I should say the ECA supplied wire, which just simply gets mounted to the siren from the side and plugs into the hull. Great little bit of detailing once added. And also on the headlights, you can see the addition of the little canister that's found on either side. The canister that's found on the brush guards is another bit of detailing I always seem to reference in these Sherman videos. On the real Sherman tank, when the headlight would not be in place, there would be this little chain retained plunger in this section over here, and simply just caps off this section, preventing moisture from getting inside the vehicle. But even though the plugs are not present, the canisters would definitely still be. The canisters themselves are very easily manufactured in 1/16 scale. This is small heat shrink tubing that's not shrunk at all. It's the perfect size in the cool format. You just simply cut it to shape and glue them to the two areas here on either side of the brush guard, and now your model now has some extra detailing. This leads us to the next bit of detailing found on the front, which are the side view mirror mounts. The M4 Sherman was really cool in that they had these side view mirrors that would connect to either side here, and this was used for transport use. But as one would imagine, these are very, very frail and easily damaged, so during combat operations, generally these were removed and stored indoors. But regardless, the mounts would still be present. The mounts are just made out of thin pieces of aluminum that were bent to shape, and a small little hole was drilled in each of them for good measure, and this gives you the appropriate detailing for these parts. Although the vehicle does not have them fitted in place, they would always have the mounts present on the front hull. And it's a great, easy way to add that much more extra detailing to your M4A3 in any scale by just fabricating the mounts. Simple little strip of aluminum from a soda can is really all you need. One change that was made to the model was with the Browning M1919. Here you get to see the unit fitted in place, and this is not the original kit one. I did touch upon this in the other video, but here you get to see what the ECA components look like fully painted and weathered. In addition to the ECA 1919 LED barrel, you also get to see the MG cover right over here. This is just a cast rest component and adapted perfectly to the Mato model, along with use of the ECA 1919. The 1919 was painted and weathered in my usual format with use of dry brushing as well as a little bit of airbrushing for the soot there for the muzzle fouling, but you will be able to see this in better depth once the unit is in operation and the LED is flickering. Another new addition that was added to the model, was also a new addition to the ECA catalog, was with the A-frame travel lock. This was something that was the subject of a new product announcement video, but here you get to see what the unit looks like fitted in place, fully completed. The original one was there, but like I mentioned in that other video, the shape is wrong, the scale is a bit off, and the piece just leaves lots of room for improvement. The ECA one drops into place and is a much better detailed piece overall, and it really does polish up the front portion here of the model immensely. This piece is not just something that can be added to the Mato, but it's also something that can be added to the Taken as well as the headlong for the same results. The piece is still functional in that I can open it like this. However, the lock mechanism, like I mentioned before, is integrally printed on solid, so it is not functional in that regard, but the piece does hinge, as you can see. Also, it has the hatch retention latch right over there, which is a bit of detailing that's absent on the stock units. With the piece dropped back into place, as you can see, the latch, oddly enough, does do a somewhat decent job in keeping it where it needs to be. And once it's all stowed away, it really does have the appropriate look, which would be found on the actual counterpart. Moving back topside takes us to the bow hatch area. First, back to the front casted section over here. Cast texturing was added to this location in order to give the model a little bit more accuracy. And the second thing is with the hatches. The hatches are the kit original ones. They're pretty good. But the one thing that I did change on them was with the periscope. The model does have the molded in periscope, and it does have a chunky brush guard. These were replaced with a HD 3D printed one with the periscope detailing that you see here. These are an aftermarket component from shapeways.com, and I utilize these on all of my 116 Sherman builds and US tank builds, and they are excellent in detailing. The one side effect that they do have, however, is fragility. They are very frail and can be broken very easily. So much so that, like I stated in the other video, if you're looking for a vehicle to just drive with and be more functional than form, you might want to just stick with the Mato ones because they are built, oddly enough, like a Sherman tank. These ones here, they look much better, they look more appropriate, but they are more frail. So that is something that the user does have to pay attention to when utilizing these parts. However, if you're erring on the side of detail fidelity, these components here I really couldn't recommend them enough. Carrying on brings us to the Pioneer tools. These are all stock with the model, and I basically just painted and weathered them to the following condition. Nothing really much to mention there. Just the only thing I do want to mention is that the straps that are seen here on the real units would be leather or webbing, and so when you're building the model, you have an option to paint them in either format. Here I used Tamiya khaki in order to replicate it as the webbing type material that would be used for the tie-down straps, and that's really all you need to really mention about that. And that's all there is to mention with the hull, and this brings us to the turret. So, the very first thing that should be jumping out at you is the texturing. This was done with the same techniques that I mentioned on the transmission cover for basically the exact same outcome. As you can see, the turret looks much more Shermanific, I should say, and I guess, yeah, we'll just coin that term. Much more Shermanific with the texturing found on these following components. Same is also true, by the way, for the mantlet that you see right here for, again, the exact same reasons. So on the mantlet, while we're here, you can see the booster section of the Coax 1919. This again is the ECA component. This is what it looks like fully painted and weathered. As a quick note, one thing I do want to mention is that a common mistake I see on the Sherman tank models in a multitude of scales is people don't understand how far out the 1919 sticks from the Sherman mantlet. I've seen people where they have basically 3/4 of the barrel sticking out, and that is just not the case. On the Sherman tank, with the way the mounts are for the 1919 receiver, it's all the way back in here, and with the way the 1919 is with the length of the barrel, by the time it reaches the end portion here of the mantlet, only the very tip portion of the booster is emerging. No more, no less. So this is, again, a common mistake I've seen on a multitude of different Shermans that are out there. If you're working on a Sherman, only have about this much of the barrel stick out and you're good to go. The next thing I want to mention is with the lift rings. So the lift rings that you see on the turret here are actually plastic ones from the headlong runner that I had in my spare parts bin. The reason why I used those instead of the metal ones was I felt that the ones from the Henlong are better in quality, and they just have a more appropriate look to them. If you've ever seen the Sherman rings, they're very thick and chunky, and these are best replicated on the model here with the plastic ones. They just simply got glued on into their appropriate locations, and this here's the final end result of it. The back portion takes to the 50 cal storage equipment, and on this model here, I did a departure compared to my usual Shermans. This Sherman here is depicting a mid-production M4A3, and because of that, I went with a slightly different format for the 50 cal storage equipment. On the later production versions of the Sherman, this was also true for several mid-productions that were upgraded as well. The 50 storage system was as follows. We have a storage pintle right here on the bustle. This is true for both. And we also have here the clamp that secures the receiver in place. The way this works is you would take the 50 while still mounted on its cradle, it would lock into this section over here, and that front section with the perforations on it would be clamped solid in this area and would hold it at bay. The barrel, obviously, on a 50 would stick out too much, so the barrel is removed, and then it would be stowed somewhere on the vehicle. On the later production versions, we had those iconic angle iron sections that emerge from the rear bustle here and wrap around, and the barrel would actually lock in into this type of format, like you see here that I'm illustrating. But this was a later design feature. Originally, the barrel storage equipment was located right here on the top portion of the turret. And this here is the setup that we have found on this example. So starting with the pintle, this is a cast resting component from ECA. It's been on the catalog now for basically since I started the 1/16 scale parts catalog, and it's going to stay on there for the foreseeable future. The molds are in a fantastic shape, and they still output a quality part, so there's no point phasing it out at this time. The clamp rack over here is a H3 3D printed component from ECA, and this again is a newer addition to the product line. It's been around now for a year or so, and this component here is literally the 1/6 scale version, but just miniaturized down to 1/16. This does have some very nice detailing to it, like the weld beads as well as the little latch and lock mechanism, and the part is very nicely rendered, but it is also very frail, as one can see. With the thicknesses that are required to get to scale thickness, this is at the expense of fragility. So this is again a very detailed piece, but it's one that you have to take care with when handling the model. The component though, once added in place, you really get to see just how much life it brings the rear portion of this turret. And this brings us to the top portion of the turret in regards to the 50 cal storage equipment, and this is the rack section for the barrel. And this was something that was discussed in more depth in the new product announcement video, but now here's what the same parts look like fully painted and weathered. So here we have the rabbit ears mount right over here with its elevator as well as its weld beads present. And here we have the rear clamp section again with the weld beads as well as the other details that I referenced before. One thing that I like about this set is that this really does add so much more variation to the model compared to leaving it in the late configuration that we've seen rinsed, washed, and repeated on all the other M4A3s on the market. Again, if you ever worked on the Henlong or the Tegan example, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. By rendering this one in the mid-production type format, this is again another way to just add a little bit more extra spice to the build as opposed to going with the later pattern. Of course, you could go with the later pattern, it will be perfectly fine, but you know, if you just want to add a little bit of extra seasoning to your build, if you will, this is a great way to do so. Aside from the clamps, you can see the remainder of the details, such as the three little tie-down straps that are found in this portion here of the bustle. These, I believe, I scratch built. I'm not sure if they were there originally, but regardless, you can see what they look like fitted in place. On the rear antenna mount, by the way, this is not a machine gun mount. This is an antenna mount. A lot of people mess that up on these Shermans, and it's another one of those like perennial things I always mention in these videos for good reason. This is only used for mounting on an antenna, never an MG. So as for the antenna mount, there's actually a small little hole right over here on the back. This was added with a pin vise and a small Dremel bit, as it was missing on the stock model. And on that note, a drainage hole was also added on the bottom base portion here of the main antenna well. This is another common bit of detailing that's done to Shermans, and it's one that's generally missed by most manufacturers. On the antenna itself, here we have the ubiquitous American MP48. This is the EastCoastArmory.com component. And as you can see, it works as good as all the other ECA mounts. The piece does have a real spring in it, and as for the unit itself, it is painted in a different color olive drab. Again, another way to add that much more extra flavor to your build. This one here is just painted with Tamiya olive drab, and that differs from the color that I use for the main base coat. And again, another common mistake made on so many American tanks out there, your insulators. If you watch my videos, you'll know what I'm talking about, and if you do, you probably already know this by now, and you do this on your own builds, or at least I hope you do. The insulator is ceramic on the MP48. A lot of people mess that up. I've seen so many builds out there where they do a beautiful job on the Sherman, and then they forget to paint that damn insulator every time. It's like almost like clockwork at this point. The insulator is painted with Tamiya Hull Red, then a swipe of Tamiya Gloss Clear is all that's added to give it that nice porcelain glaze look like you see on my example. The other thing to mention on these antenna bases is with the knurled end connectors. Here you get to see what they look like on the ECA unit, and they are painted different colors as they are seen like that on the real examples. The bottom one is blue and the top one is red. Carrying on to the remainder of the turret top details, here we have another periscope brush guard right over there. It's the same HD 3D printed component that I referenced before. We also have, by the way, a lacking bit of detail, and this was done on purpose, in this location over here. If anyone knows Shermans, you'll know that there's sometimes a smoke grenade launcher right over here. And this is a bit of detailing, or I should say it's a feature that even the American designers didn't know if they wanted it or not. The Army kept on flip-flopping on this. They originally wanted it, then they got rid of it. Then they wanted it again, then they got rid of it. Then some had it welded over, they put a patch. It was just... There's so many different variations out there for these, and on this example over here, I left it without the mortar detailing present. So that's another thing that the builder could pay attention to, and again, this is part of the fun we're working on Shermans. Same is also true, by the way, for the shell ejection port. This was another thing that was flipped up on quite a bit, but that's a story for another day. On the front portion here of the turret, we have the spotlight. The spotlight here is an HD 3D printed component from shapeways.com. I have the vendor for this as well as also with the brush guards listed below in the video description. And this is, again, a nice detailed component, and it's so excellent that I utilize on all of my 1/16 builds for good reasons. They are phenomenal. The light is absolutely perfectly detailed with all of its pressed can shroud detailing ribs that are there. Even has the sight, it has the correct shape handle. These things are awesome. Since they are made out of an HD material, they are translucent, so the lens, hopefully this comes out in focus, you can see is clear. In order to achieve the complete illusion, what I do is on the back portion I paint it with silver paint, and then I paint the olive drab over it so that when the component is completed, when you look at the lens, you will see silver popping through, which will give it a nice realistic look. Just like with the antenna base, I painted this with Tamiya with Tamiya olive drab, which again gives the model just a little bit more extra color pop compared to just leaving it painted with the same base coat that's found on the remainder of the model. Moving to the Commander's cupola takes us to some of the mods that were made here, which would include the addition of the headlight periscope cluster that I mentioned before, and also an addition of an ECA deployed travel lock. The travel lock here is rendered in the deployed state like I just referenced, and on the catalog it's offered in two different options: retracted and deployed. This one here, obviously I went with the deployed one just because, why not? It just gives a little bit extra detailing and a little bit more, again, variety compared to rendering them all with it in its retracted state. Of course, the cupola is fully able to rotate, and by the way, this is where that mistake comes from, where people mis-ID the antenna base mount here for the machine gun mount, because this cupola here can rotate 360 degrees, as you can see, and when it has a 15 mounted on in that position, and when you see the vehicle in this manner, you could quickly see how a lot of people misconstrue that as that's where the MG mount goes. They see this the vehicle in this type of configuration, they look on the back of their model, they say, oh look, it's got a plate with 4 bolts on it, ergo, that's the MG mount, and that's where they put it. And if you do that,
congratulations, you played yourself.
Because you have basically won the Sherman Darwin Award. That should not go there, ever. Never, ever, 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 ever put an MG mount here. Ever! Anyone, if they're ever wondering, if you know a friend that's thinking about it, show them this video. Never put an MG mount there. Seriously, don't ever do that. So, carrying on, takes us to the vane sight. This here is, again, an HD 3D printed component from ECA, and this is the later vane sight. Now, what's unique is that the split ring cupola does have a vane sight integrally built in, and it's found right here on the hatch. This little half moon cutout right there, that's a vane sight, but it's not uncommon for these vehicles to be upgraded in field, and they have the other vane sight like the one you see presently. So again, this is up to the taste of the builder. Me personally, you know, I like to have more detail than not. Since I have the parts on hand, why not? So yeah, that's the component we have here. As you can see, just, you know, stuff like this is just what makes Shermans just so much, you know, more eye-catching and detailing compared to some other tanks that are out there. But, you know, it's part of the fun, as I always say. The last bit of detailing takes us to the M2HB. This here is not the original kit component. The original kit one is very, very basic, and honestly, it's easier to just straight up replace it than it is to, you know, try to polish it. And the unit that we have here is actually a two-part set that's all listed on shapeways.com, and again, I have the vendors listed below. These are both HD 3D print, and they are offered by two vendors, yet the two work perfectly with one another. The M2HB is on a 3050 Cradle mount, and the mount just gets modified to be fitted in place onto the cupola that we have here. The M2HB is weathered and painted in my usual format, where I go ahead and paint the handles to look like red Bakelite. Again, there's some options available. You have wood during World War II, you have black Bakelite, but you know me, I'm a sucker for red Bakelite. Just makes the models look all that much more better, so that's how I rolled with on this build. The model is still painted and weathered in my usual format, you know, dry brushing and then a little soot airbrushing over there on the muzzle section. Also, I added a rack number right there on top of the dust cover because why not? It just gives just so much more extra character to the model, as you can see. And the 3050 mount is painted with Tamiya olive drab, again, you know, for the same reasons that I mentioned before. It's, you know, the little things like that that give the model so much extra character, and again, just makes it look that much more polished compared to, you guessed it, painting it with the same color as everything else. And that's all there is to mention about the detailing. This takes the paint and the weathering. So, being a World War II Sherman tank, you bet olive drab is going to be on the menu. For the shade of olive drab here, this is the same wartime color that I cobbled together about 15 years ago, and this shade has been used on a large number of the models seen on this channel in both large and small scale. The paint is exterior latex and was applied via the airbrush. Of course, the model was thoroughly primed beforehand in order to get the paint to stick on, as I often mention in these videos. The remainder of the weathering was done with the use of an airbrush for the counter shading, as well as dry brushing for the chipping. The one weathering technique that I did not utilize on this build was the washing and filtering, and this is something that I've been using on my builds in recent months and years, but for this one here, I decided not to do it for two reasons. One, I just wanted to build look a little bit different compared to some of the other builds I've been doing, and the other reason is more strategic. You see, this is a radio-controlled tank, and RC models have the propensity of getting scratched from time to time, just, you know, with operation. And if you need to do any touch-ups, it's much more easily done if you don't have those other techniques in place as opposed to if you do. So if you're, you know, if you have a little scratch and you want to touch it up, the paint will blend in a lot better since there's no other filters on the surface. This is something that perhaps someone should consider when they're doing a radio control tank. You know, you may want to have that in the back of your mind. Yes, these weathering techniques look awesome, the tank looks amazing, but if it gets scratched, is it something that I can easily touch up or cover up? And if you do not have those, you know, washes on hand, you are going to have something that's going to be very noticeable and something that could potentially hurt the look of your model. On all of my 1/6 scale and also all of my commission builds, I always give a bottle of touch-up paint specifically to the RC ones in order just to, you know, maintain the model after it leaves my shop and it's in the custody of the new owner. So you can see that if the model is not painted with those various techniques, how much more easily it's going to be touched up in case the need ever arises. As for the marking, these are water slide decals. However, I do not have any 1/16 scale decals on hand. I kind of, you know, used them up with all the builds that I've done over the years. But one trick that I utilize on my 1/16s is I actually recycle decals from 1/35 scale models. And this is something that actually I had a question about this on one of my videos by one of my longtime subscribers, and you know who you are out there. Hopefully you're watching this video. And he asked the exact same question, and I told him, use decals from your spare bin from 135s. Although this may sound preposterous, you know, the tank is so much bigger being 116 compared to 135, keep in mind these markings, they came in a multitude of different sizes, and it's not out of the question to have markings that were smaller in size compared to some other ones. So the 135th scale markings, although they are generally smaller in scale, they can still pass on a 116 scale model like the one that you see here. The stars, the TO&E marks, those are all spares in my decal bin from a 135th scale kit or two from various manufacturers that I've built over the years. And once the decals went on, the entire model was coated with VMS matte varnish in order to seal them to the surface, giving you for the end result that you see presently. However, one thing that I really do wish that we had available in the 116 hobby was a better selection of markings. There are some pretty good German markings out there, but when it comes for Allied, specifically American markings, there's really slim pickings. Archer dry transfers used to have some excellent sets out there, but sadly they're no longer in the business of making the dry transfers or even markings in 116, so that kind of sucks. But you know, it pales in comparison to what we have in 135. 135, there's like, you know, 7 ways from Sunday in order to mark a Sherman tank with stars and TO&E marks and everything that you can imagine. And I just wish we had that type of variety and availability in 116 as well. So if anyone's watching this video out there that has the resources on making professional quality decals, please, you know, I will gladly buy from you, if they're good quality, of course. And with that, that wraps up part 2 of this 3-part video series for this radio-controlled 116 scale M4A3 Sherman tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being part 1 and part 3 of this video series when they get posted, as well as keeping up to date on the other larger scale and smaller scale model showcase videos and project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel previously. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on part 3. See you there.